Once known as a pristine mirror of the sky, this lake in southwest China was quietly drowning, choked by filth no one wanted to admit was there. For years, it sparkled in photos, praised in tourist guides, and ignored by those profiting from its slow decay. But then something changed. Behind closed doors, a radical decision was made. Bulldozers rolled in. Businesses vanished overnight. And beneath the surface, literally, crews uncovered something that left even seasoned scientists speechless. Why would a government rip apart a booming economy to save a dying lake? This is not a story about nature. It's a story about what happens when denial runs out of time and consequences start to surface. The lake that gave life. Nestled high in the mountains of Yunnan province, Erhai Lake has long served as more than a scenic landmark. It was the very heart of the Bai ethnic minority. Revered as the mother lake, Erhai sustained generations with its waters, traditions, and spiritual depth. Families lived in rhythm with the lake, children learned to swim in it, elders prayed along its shores, and farmers tied their harvest rituals to its seasonal moods. It was a lifeblood and a legacy, quietly weaving itself into the everyday customs, stories, and songs of the Dali region. This deep-rooted connection was not simply emotional, it shaped an entire way of life. Erhai's physical and economic roles were equally profound. Fishing boats once glided across its surface daily, supporting modest markets with native fish, while its waters irrigated terraced rice fields carved into surrounding hills. Villagers built their homes and routines around the lake's patterns, synchronizing planting cycles, water storage, and even local crafts with its natural flow. Tie-dye fabrics and ceramic pots depended on clean water for washing and cooling. This harmony wasn't accidental, it reflected generations of careful stewardship, where nature and community existed in quiet balance. Geographically, too, Erhai was a marvel, a rare alpine freshwater ecosystem at 6,450 feet, nestled between the Tsangshan Mountains and Dali. Fed by snowmelt and highland streams, it moderated local climate and harbored unique aquatic species, its calm surface concealing both beauty and vulnerability. In the past, Erhai was a solitary example of how human beings and nature could coexist before it fell apart. It wasn't only the local people who admired the lake, they depended on it for sustenance. This can be reflected in the seasonal holidays they've had, their forms of agriculture, and their careful respect for the limits. To such visitors, Erhai appeared to be a sanctuary, a photograph of mountain, water, and culture, mixed idyllically. But for the people with whom it resided, the lake was a necessity, sacred. Such a balance proved to be a fragile thing indeed, however. And when it went wrong, the consequences came not as a sudden gale, but as a digital tide. Erhai Lake was transformed between 2013 and 2016, not by benevolent natural forces but by viral popularity. This flood of social media influencers shunted the region from a fishing village into photogenic, Instagram town territories. With the arrival of more than 40 million visitors annually, the region was cumbrously ill-equipped to face the inundation. Guest houses and cafes mushroomed everywhere with little clarity about the sewage systems or permits. Wastewater ran unchecked into the blocks used for drainage or ditches that lead onto the lake. Under strain, the infrastructure collapsed, refuse all over, toilets choked, and old sewer systems couldn't handle it anymore. While the environmental signs of stress accumulated, business interests kept entering and public enthusiasm kept growing, while action remained far pending. The loveliness of the lake, once from its brilliance in the water and the timelessness of cultural continuity, was now sinking under the weight of its own fame. Then, just as Erhai reached peak fame, the very attention that glorified it began to unravel what had once held it together. Collapse in silence. Long before Erhai Lake made national headlines, nature had already begun signaling distress, but those signals were easy to miss. The first red flag appeared in the form of greenish scum drifting across the surface in warmer months. What looked like harmless pondweed was in fact cyanobacteria, a toxic form of algae that thrives in water overloaded with nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. These blooms, often mistaken by casual observers for seasonal plant life, were fueled by untreated sewage and agricultural runoff seeping into the lake. As the algae multiplied, they blocked sunlight from reaching native aquatic plants and began consuming the oxygen critical to fish and invertebrate survival. What followed was a quiet unraveling of the lake's biological web, largely unnoticed by the tourists snapping photos from paddle boats above. Water quality began to deteriorate across multiple dimensions. Chemically, tests showed increasing levels of nitrates, phosphates, and ammonia, byproducts of human waste and fertilizer. Biologically, native species like Atelia acuminata, a flowering aquatic plant once abundant near the shore, began to disappear. This plant played a key role in oxygenating the water and providing habitat for smaller organisms. As it vanished, a chain reaction unfolded, oxygen levels dropped in deeper zones, fish populations declined, and the lake's self-cleaning mechanisms began to falter. Visually, the water remained deceptively serene in many areas, but in key stretches, swimmers reported a musty smell, fishermen noted floating debris and oily sheens, and farmers began to notice strange colors and odors in the irrigation canals that fed their fields. The ecological changes put a local settler's livelihood through harder times first, especially for those still depending on the lake, whether directly or indirectly. Fishermen have traditionally plied those waters with heavy nets, now they return from the lake with even lighter nets and they are altogether empty. From fishermen, they have turned into sightseers and are now converting their boats into the tourist industry. Those farmers who used water for irrigation from the lake have started noticing the consequences slow down in crop growth, but this land is reputed to have vegetable products growing spots or a bad smell, marking them unfit for sale. Therefore, the economy subtly shifted from an ecologically balanced one to one supported by transient tourist dollars, as fragile from ecological consequences as the lake itself. Erhai, though from far away, managed to present a picture-perfect postcard. Flawless footage by drone showed glimmering waters with swans glittering in the mountains. Travel ads painted a picturesque world, whereas Jim hid the rot spreading under the skin. The deep scars carried by the environment were never seen by the ordinary outsider, while many locals turned a blind eye as they made their buck out of the tourist boom. It is too late for nature since the screen was silent when the public took notice of the disaster. The crackdown and the cleanup. By late 2016, the situation at Erhai Lake had become impossible to ignore. Years of pollution, unregulated tourism, and infrastructural neglect had pushed the ecosystem to the brink. Internal government assessments painted a dire picture. Unchecked contamination threatened not only biodiversity but also the future of agriculture, fishing, and tourism, the core pillars of Dallas' regional economy. Under mounting pressure from Beijing to act decisively on environmental matters, local officials realized that half measures would not suffice. The lake was collapsing, and so the response had to be swift, forceful, and uncompromising. On March 1, 2017, the government launched one of the most aggressive environmental crackdowns in modern Chinese history. Over 2,400 lakeside establishments, including cafes, guest houses, and bars, were abruptly shut down. Bulldozers rolled in overnight, signage was stripped, buildings were gutted, and entire neighborhoods were razed without appeal or delay. Many business owners woke up to find their livelihoods erased in a matter of hours. The abruptness shocked the public, and reactions were deeply divided. Older residents welcomed the crackdown as long overdue, believing it was the only way to save the lake that had nourished their families for generations. Others, particularly those who had poured their life savings into the tourism boom, saw the move as ruthless and unjust. The emotional aftermath was accompanied by attention turned quickly to the lake itself. Any pollution that could have emanated from there was put to rest after much stricter enforcement of the laws against pollution. However, beneath the surface lay years of accumulated waste. What ensued was a difficult and nerve-wracking cleanup of the lake bottom, its tributaries, and its surrounding land. Here, teams of engineers, workers, and environmental specialists had to be deployed to remove all sludge, all debris, and all toxins accumulated over the years. Accumulations in hotspots such as the Lusrong River were so thick that they had to be removed by manual labor. Plastic, decayed food, metal objects, and industrial wastes buried deep under thick reeds and silt. Heavy mechanical dredgers sucked up the choked black sludge in the main part of the lake, saturated with nutrients that had fed the algal blooms slaying the aquatic life. The sludge from parts of the lake bottom was so devoid of oxygen that it was termed biologically dead. More than 40,000 tons of contaminated waste have been removed, which would equal the weight of approximately 6,500 elephants. Yet more revealing than the scale of the waste was its silent persistence. hidden pipes still leaked sewage behind patches of greenery. The worst discharges of unfiltered waste were located at the two former guesthouse sites. It seemed that everything was placid at the surface, but the lake was rotten from beneath. The cleaning, therefore, was not only an exercise in rehabilitation, it was a moment of truth. It brought out the cost to the environment of unashamedly bad growth, and it forced a fresh appreciation of the extremely fine line between development and destruction. What looked outwardly like a pristine environment, in truth, had been slowly disintegrating for years. The crackdown may have cleared the view, but what lay beneath the surface revealed just how deep the damage truly ran. Infrastructure meets intelligence. Following the initial cleanup of Erhai Lake, Chinese engineers and officials shifted their focus to preventing future contamination, a task they knew would determine whether the lake's recovery would be temporary or lasting. Their answer was bold and systemic: the 19-mile-long sewage pipeline encircling the entire lake to intercept all forms of wastewater before it could reach the water. This barrier collected sewage, agricultural runoff, and stormwater from villages, farms, and businesses and diverted it toward newly built treatment centers. It marked a critical shift from reactive cleanup to proactive protection, a foundation meant to shield the lake from further human impact. To support this massive undertaking, multiple wastewater treatment plants were constructed at strategic points throughout the region. These facilities featured advanced technologies like sedimentation tanks, biofilters, and ultraviolet disinfection systems capable of neutralizing bacteria and viruses. In tandem, dozens of pumping stations were added in low-lying zones to intercept overflow runoff. This entire network operated as a dynamic system, adjusting to seasonal rainfall and pollution loads in real time. Importantly, the upgrades extended beyond public systems. Entire neighborhoods had their plumbing ripped up and replaced. Outdated pipes were sealed, homes reconnected to the new grid, and every property became a monitored node in a broader defense system. But hardware isn't the only transformation it has undergone. Right from the first day, data was the invisible force driving restoration. Water quality sensors have been installed across the lake and its feeder streams and now transmit real-time metrics showing the turbidity, oxygen, and chlorophyll levels. With these data points, crews were enabled to act before conditions worsened, such as adjusting dredging schedules or bolstering filtration efforts. Putting some academics into the mix, Yunnan University brought some heavy-duty modeling tools to the table, identifying pollution hotspots, predicting outcomes of interventions, and sequencing restoration phases with scientific precision. This feedback loop links data, fieldwork, and strategy, ushering in a highly adaptive environment for restoration. Thus, when the sensors warned that dredging might release nutrients more than expected, methods were changed. It was similar to the designs of early wetlands that exceeded expectations and got replicated somewhere else. Again, technology had a tighter enforcement too. Violation alerts run in real time, flagged by surveillance cameras, mobile patrols, and automated alerts incurred new penalties. The project then became not only involving a site repair but also a live case scenario of how infrastructure, intelligence, and enforcement can come together to protect a meagerly supported ecosystem, turning Erhai from a loophole into a case showing all-around resilience. While pipes and treatment plants provided the technical backbone of Erhai Lake's recovery, the most visionary dimension came from nature itself. Engineers and ecologists understood that true restoration required more than containment, it needed regeneration. As part of the Erhai Ecological Corridor project, hundreds of acres of degraded shoreline and streamside zones were transformed into wetlands. These weren't just scenic buffers but living filtration systems. Dense vegetation and intricate root networks worked to absorb excess nitrogen, trap sediments, and break down organic pollutants, creating a natural defense line before contaminants could reach the open lake. The wetland design was guided by ecological precision. Native plants like reeds, cattails, and aquatic grasses were chosen not just for their resilience to the Yunnan Plateau's climate, but for their environmental function. Their roots filtered pollutants, stabilized soil, and encouraged biodiversity by creating new microhabitats. Positioned along critical tributaries such as the Luosi-Jiang River, these wetlands functioned like ecological sieves, slowing water flow, capturing sediment, and stripping nutrients before releasing cleaner water into the lake. Unlike concrete embankments, these green interventions are adapted to the land's rhythms, working in harmony rather than opposition. Over and above their ecological function, these wetlands catalyzed an evolution in the very organisms and communities that existed next to them. Extinct lands transformed into areas with wooden bridges, bird-watch decks, and paths for walking. Herons and egrets returned, soon to discover curious children and camera-shot tourists beyond. The shared civil activity thus became part nature reserve and part park, the formerly unapproachable land. Instead of forcing rivers into stiff channels, the restoration crews embraced flexible watercourses that mimic old floodplains and slow the runoff. In doing so, they allowed nature its room for self-repair instead of trying to control it. The payoff came quickly and dramatically. Water clarity surged, from less than a foot to more than 7 in key areas by 2020, signaling true chemical and biological recovery. The golden line barbel, a native fish thought locally extinct for decades, returned not only in scattered sightings but in breeding populations. Delicate aquatic plants reappeared, algal blooms declined, and oxygen levels rose. Frogs, insects, and waterfowl followed. Scientific journals began citing Ojai as a rare case of rapid freshwater recovery. What began as a daring ecological bet became both a local triumph and a global example. For the scientists and residents who once feared the lake was lost, its revival offered not just hope, but vindication. What began as a local act of repair was quietly becoming a blueprint others were eager to follow. Restoration that inspired nations. Ojai Lake's recovery didn't just bring back clear waters and native fish, it sparked a full-scale transformation in how the region functioned, socially and economically. After the 2017 crackdown and the massive cleanup efforts, Dallas' once thriving tourism industry hit a steep decline. But instead of fading into obscurity, it reinvented itself. With stricter environmental regulations in place, only guest houses and cafes equipped with approved sewage systems and waste management plans were allowed to operate. The chaotic, unregulated boom of the past was replaced by a more deliberate, sustainable model. By 2021, lakeside towns like Shuanglai had re-emerged as ecotourism hubs, drawing visitors not just for the views, but for the story, how a dying lake had been brought back to life. The agricultural sector, too, underwent a significant shift. Before the restoration, many farmers around Ojai relied on high-yield, high-impact crops like garlic and rapeseed, which required heavy use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, one of the major contributors to lake pollution. New environmental rules rendered those practices unsustainable. In response, farmers began to experiment with low-impact, high-value alternatives such as cherries, blueberries, and organic vegetables. These crops not only fetched higher prices in cleaner label markets but also helped reduce nutrient runoff into the lake. Government programs provided training and support, and in time, a new generation of environmentally conscious farming practices took root, proving that ecological stewardship and economic success were not mutually exclusive. Perhaps the most powerful force of such an environmental restoration has emerged from the changing attitudes of the Dali people. What was initially a government-imposed environmental crackdown grew into a kind of grassroots movement. Watershed education found its way into school science curricula, local families began organizing regular cleanup days, even children could confidently speak about nitrogen levels and algae blooms. Skeptical residents were beginning to take pride in what they felt were their stewardship obligations of Ojai. Conservation was no longer an abstract concept, it was now lived and felt as a responsibility right at the local level. What once seemed a bitter sacrifice has, instead, transformed into a real second chance with a rise in civic pride not merely about the recovery of this lake but also about all it took together. This myth has really gone beyond the boundary of China. The lake also speaks of an international interest to delegations such as Southeast Asia, Africa, and South Asia with regard to transformation in the lake, along with their desire to replicate that transformation in their endangered watersheds. Now, Ojai serves as a reference by policy and science forums in international venues on what can happen when science meets political will and public support. That has moved with time from a story of tricky progress that only raised red flags of imminent ecological collapse to an active witness to environmental redemption. No damages are irreversible as proof that not only does rehabilitation work, it inspires the whole world to change.